Mr. Lim Boon Heng, Chairman of Temasek Holdings, Ms. Ho Ching, Executive Director and CEO of Temasek Holdings, Mr. Dilan Pillay, CEO of Temasek International, Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very happy to join you this morning for the inaugural Singapore Sustainable Investing and Financing Conference. As we saw from the video just now, COVID-19 has truly changed the world as we know it. We now have a taste of what a global public health disaster could look like. But we also know that there is a much larger crisis looming ahead for humanity, and that's the threat of climate change. COVID-19 may turn out to be a dress rehearsal for the depredations as well as the tragedies that this climate emergency could bring. But as highlighted in the theme of this conference, From Crisis to Opportunity, the pandemic can also be a turning point for positive change to bring greater focus and urgency in our efforts to reduce global emissions. Indeed, throughout this pandemic, individuals, businesses, and governments have come together to flatten the infection curve. Climate change doesn't happen as quickly as the spread of the SARS-CoV-2 virus, but the Earth is warming faster than previously thought, and the window to avoid catastrophic outcomes is closing. So we must now come together to flatten the curve of greenhouse gas emissions. In fact, we shouldn't just flatten, we must bring it down to net zero in order to avert the climate pandemic. All of us can and must do our part as individuals in this endeavor, change our lifestyle and habits, and reduce our personal carbon footprint. But individual efforts can only go so far. We also need system-level solutions for effective and permanent change. Some of this has to be achieved through intergovernmental agreements like those fostered by the UNFCCC. But at the same time, the banking, finance, and investment communities play a critical role in facilitating investments in renewable energy solutions and carbon-neutral technologies. Even from a narrow investment perspective, there are good reasons why we need to start changing our thinking in this area. Because as we continue to decarbonize the global economy, the demand for fossil fuels will wane. Large investments in coal mines or oil wells may lose their value. And so there is a very real risk of these assets ceasing to be profitable and becoming stranded. And that's why all of us in the industry have to take ESG considerations seriously. In the past, investors weren't always so sure about taking into account ESG factors into their investment decisions. Even now, I think you heard the MC say the survey results, it isn't 100%. But in the past, this used to be worse because people worried that ESG would not be consistent with their fiduciary responsibilities to their clients. Their fiduciary duty is to maximize returns on the portfolio with the given risk. And the concern was that ESG would be in conflict with this. But today, I think more and more have shifted their position and recognizing that ESG is completely consistent with their fiduciary duties. In fact, they now view investment decision-making through the lens of their larger responsibilities to their clients, which includes considerations for long-term sustainability. These are positive developments, but the industry as a whole still needs to do much more to enable the transition to a low-carbon future. And in particular, there are several critical enablers that will help accelerate this move. First, we need clarity for investors in the form of consistent and credible definitions of both green and transition to provide assurance that such activities are truly contributing to our decarbonization objectives. This will facilitate investment in such activities and help close the sizable financing gap. For example, ASEAN alone will need an estimated $200 US billion in green investments annually through 2030. So efforts to develop a regional taxonomy will increase the integrity of ASEAN's sustainable finance market and help make our green and transition assets and projects more investable. We should also recognize the role of transition sectors and activities in our taxonomies in order to ensure that capital can be directed to activities that are shifting to a greener trajectory and have a strategy for longer-term decarbonization. Second, we need to improve the availability, quality, and comparability of data to enable companies, financial institutions, and investors to measure progress towards sustainability goals and measure the impact of their operations and investments. This is a critical issue because data acquisition today is largely manual, it's costly, it's cumbersome, and it's still prone to errors. In this regard, technology can and should be a potential solution, and it's heartening to see the use of artificial intelligence, satellite imagery, Internet of Things, IoT devices in a range of use cases. All of this can help increase data accuracy and granularity. Third, besides good data, we need to implement a consistent set of global standards for disclosures and reporting. The good news, of course, as all of you know, is that more and more global monies are going into ESG investments. On average, 2 new ESG funds are launched every day. Unfortunately, this has been accompanied by rampant greenwashing. 2 years ago, the Wall Street Journal reported that 8 out of 10 of the biggest sustainable funds in the US were in fact investing in oil companies. There's less greenwashing these days, but it still happens. So we need greater consistency and reliability of disclosures. This will then help investors put their money into truly green firms, ensure a better allocation of capital, and a faster energy transition. So I've highlighted 3 enablers around taxonomy, data, and disclosures. Singapore is active in shaping these efforts both regionally and internationally. On taxonomy, the Green Finance Industry Task Force convened by the MES is developing a taxonomy for Singapore-based financial institutions. We are also actively participating in efforts to develop a regional taxonomy to take into account international goals while tailoring it to ASEAN's context and circumstances. On data, MES has recently launched Project Greenprint, which aims to harness technology and data to mobilize capital for ESG projects, monitor their commitments, and measure their impact. On disclosures, MES and SGX are setting out roadmaps for mandatory climate-related financial disclosures by financial institutions and listed entities. So we are taking all of these efforts seriously. We do so in Singapore because for us as a low-lying city-state, climate change is an existential issue. And that's why we are also advancing our national agenda on sustainability development. We have put together a Singapore Green Plan 2030 with ambitious and concrete targets over the next 10 years, covering infrastructure, urban planning, economic and financial markets. The right carbon price is also critical in ensuring that the cost of carbon are properly internalized and helps bring about a reduction in emissions. So MOF is presently reviewing the level and trajectory of our carbon tax, and we will give an update on this important matter in next year's budget. So look forward to the budget next year. In addition, we are looking at several initiatives to expand our green finance ecosystem to better serve the needs of Singapore and the region. And let me touch on 3 initiatives. First, on the market for carbon credits. We know many organizations will find it hard to eliminate their emissions or even lessen them as quickly as they like. They will want to use high-quality carbon credits to offset emissions they cannot get rid of by other means. This market for voluntary carbon credits is huge, And it's also important because carbon credits can help direct private financing to climate action projects that would otherwise not get off the ground. So the government is happy to support private sector initiatives to develop the carbon credit market in Singapore. One example is Climate Impact Exchange. Many of you would know about this. It's a joint initiative by Temasek, DBS, SGX, and Standard Chartered Bank. We are excited about this and other similar initiatives because of the potential for Singapore to become a carbon services and trading hub for the region. Carbon markets today tend to be fragmented and complex. Asia, in time to come, will need a voluntary carbon market that's large, comprehensive, transparent, verifiable, and environmentally robust. And we will do our utmost to support the development of such a market in Singapore. Second, we will catalyze sustainable financing and investing to grow the supply and demand for green investments. The government will lead the way by laying out the framework and rules, test run them with our own issuance, and find ways to convene and connect the different stakeholders. For example, NEA, the National Environment Agency, is the first statutory board to establish a $3 billion multi-currency medium-term note and green bond framework in support of our green finance market. Under my ministry, MOF, we have set up a new Green Bonds Program Office to catalyze the government's efforts in this area. The office will develop the framework and work with our statutory boards on green bond program development, as well as undertake industry engagement and manage investor relations. Individuals, small, medium enterprises, and large corporates will also need access to sustainable financing. So MAS will facilitate the issuance of sustainable financing instruments, including green and sustainability-linked bonds and loans. This will support corporates in accessing financing as they invest in green projects and transition towards more sustainable business practices. And with its Green Investments Program, MAS is also attracting more green funds and asset managers with a strong sustainability focus. These are managers with a good track record of sustainability investing, robust stewardship policies, and a strong understanding of balancing returns objective with sustainability goals. All this will help to grow our finance ecosystem. We recognize that public efforts alone will not cover the scale of climate change mitigation in the region. So we are also heartened to see efforts from the private sector to help close funding gaps for sustainable projects. One such example is the partnership between HSBC and Temasek and supported by the ADB and Clifford Capital to establish a sustainable financing platform in this area with an initial focus on Southeast Asia. This was just announced this morning. This sustainable financing platform will catalyze capital flows to the sustainable infrastructure space, and it will do so by deploying blended finance at scale over time. In other words, bringing capital from different sources to unlock more marginally bankable projects and to create a tradable asset class in sustainable infrastructure. With this and similar initiatives, we hope that more infrastructure projects in Asia, which have faced varying degrees of barriers to bankability, can receive support for project development, technical assistance, and blended finance solutions. And I would strongly encourage everyone in the private sector to continue identifying opportunities and to leverage on partnerships in this blended finance space to address climate change financing collectively. This brings me to the third area, which is to build strong capabilities and expertise in our Singaporean finance community to support green finance. We need new capabilities and skill sets. For example, we need specialized expertise to quantify environmental benefits and the cost of projects. We need to estimate how environmental costs can translate into future default risk. We need to develop tools for reporting the sustainability metrics of various projects and business lines. These are not all things that are covered in a traditional finance curriculum. It's interdisciplinary. You need to know more about environmental science, about the risks of climate change. So we do need to build these capabilities. Our institutions of higher learning are already attuned to these needs, and they are updating their curriculums to ensure that their graduates are equipped with the relevant skills. At the same time, MAS has supported the establishment of a number of sustainable finance centers of excellence to meet the demand for expertise and Asian-centric research in this area. This includes the National University of Singapore's Sustainable and Green Finance Institute, which was announced earlier this month. So I've touched on 3 areas on new initiatives or initiatives that we are embarking on around carbon credits markets, sustainable finance solutions and products, as well as building new capabilities. And we will be working on all 3 fronts, and we welcome stakeholders and partners to join us in this collective endeavor. To conclude, the COVID-19 pandemic has reminded us of the fragility of our expanding, resource-hungry civilization and our reliance on massive, but unfortunately unsustainable infrastructure for food and water on a planet with finite resources. When you look ahead at the scale of the challenge, it can truly be overwhelming. But our response to this pandemic gives us reason to be hopeful too, because we have seen throughout this pandemic that it is possible to change our ways when we must. We have also seen how the indomitable human spirit can and will always prevail against tough odds. So we have an opportunity now to get off the path of climate distress and onto a healthier path for humanity. And the choices we all make in finance and investments matter. They matter greatly. So I encourage all of us to do our part towards a greener and more sustainable future for Singapore, for the region, and for the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Minister. Perfect way to open up our session. I'd like to invite you to have a seat, please, because we'd love to hear more. There's some really great concrete examples here of how government and private sector are really working together to bridge this green financing gap. But please do take a seat. I'll be inviting someone on stage with a few questions, a few burning questions that I'm sure a lot of us have, so that we can get a little bit deeper into what you were saying. So please welcome Ms Png Chin Yee, the Deputy Chief Financial Officer from Temasek Holdings, who'll be leading the discussion with Minister. Thank you so much.
Good morning, Minister.
Morning.
Thank you for joining us this morning. I'm sure you've been very busy the last many weeks.
To say the least.
I'm glad we can do this in person, albeit at a very safe distance. Maybe I can start off with asking you about the role of government.
Sure.
Clearly, the climate emergency is one of the greatest challenges of our times, as we all acknowledged. And we need partnership between businesses, governments, regulators, and civil society to tackle this issue. So how do you think about the balance between what governments and regulators can do and what businesses should be doing and what individuals can do to address this issue?
Well, Ching Yee, I think that's a good question. And as I stated in my speech, let's start with the individual. Clearly, there is a need for all of us as individuals to take this seriously and to do our part. But we cannot stop there. If it's all about us trying to live more sustainably, reduce our emissions, it's very good, but it doesn't add up. We need systems-level solutions, as I said, and that requires governments to act, and governments can do its part by setting policies, including carbon tax, including regulations, in order to phase out, for example, appliances, equipments that are not energy efficient, phase out internal combustion engine vehicles and move towards cleaner vehicles. These all can be done through regulatory moves, coordinated internationally. And then finally, businesses have an important part to play. Because number one, it's in your own interest, recognizing that if you do not start making the shift early enough, you may be caught in investments and assets that are of higher risk and become stranded. So even from an narrow investment point of view, it is investing in ESG is good investment. As I said, this thinking didn't always used to be the case. Even as recent as 3 or 4 years ago, I think people were still struggling with this. But I think we are seeing a lot more convergence towards understanding that ESG is consistent with good investments. And that's very helpful. But the finance community in particular, the investment community, must go beyond this. And some of the ideas I talked about around data, which is still a big issue, verification, still a major issue, doing away with ensuring that we do not have greenwashing, ensuring that the finance community comes together to support the transition to a low-carbon future. I think those are important issues that the entire community will have to address.
Yeah, I will come back to some of the points that you raised. But we saw in the opening video that 124 countries around the world, representing 50% of GDP, have committed to net zero targets by 2050. China and Indonesia have committed to do so by 2060.
At its earliest.
As an aside, Mr. Sunny Verghese on Tuesday said that we've all set these targets, but not sure how many of us actually know how to get there, right? So in that context, can I just ask you, what are your views on Singapore's own climate goals? Are they ambitious enough?
We take our climate goals very seriously, and Singapore's approach, as all of you, based in Singapore would know, we may not be the most flashy in terms of talking about what we do, usually quite understated, but when we say something, we make sure we deliver on that commitment. So we take this very seriously. We work out thoroughly what we can achieve, and for now, we have put a commitment under the Paris Agreement to peak at 2030, reduce by half by 2050 to 33 million tons, and get to net zero as soon as possible thereafter. That target is not static. We continue to review it, and we continue to push the boundaries wherever we can. And that's why earlier this year we launched the Singapore Green Plan. Yep. It's really to accelerate some of our plans over the coming decade, including to push for greener buildings and greener transport. Those are things we can do. Beyond 2030, the key challenge for us is to decarbonize our fuel mix. That means it's not just about becoming more efficient in the way we do things, but upstream, get greener fuel mix into Singapore. And that's a challenge because Singapore is what we have always said, alternative energy disadvantaged. We do not have the ability to deploy at large scale renewable energy. We have no wind, no hydro, no geothermal. We have solar, and we are already one of the most solar dense cities in the world. And we will continue to innovate and find new ways to deploy more solar, not just on rooftops, but even vertical solar, because there's more vertical space than there is horizontal space. We are deploying solar on floating platforms using sea spaces wherever we can. So we will continue to push on that front. But solar will not be able to replace base load power. And for us, this is the key. We need to find something that's cleaner than natural gas and then move towards that new source. We can import green power, that's an option, but again, for energy security reasons, I don't think we want to import 100% of our power and be subject to potential threat of some of this being cut off or disrupted. So we need to find something that's base load and that allows us to generate power in a green manner. For now, the more promising options are hydrogen and carbon capture, but mainly green hydrogen. But we are studying this very carefully. We've been monitoring the developments. It is promising, but it's still not ready to deploy at scale. But we hope certainly that there will, with the way technology is evolving rapidly, we will be able to do so, say, post-2030. And this will be a massive exercise. I mean, I recall, well, we went from an energy transition that was quite massive from oil plants to natural gas.
Yes.
That was some decades ago. And say 15 years ago in 2008, I was involved in building our LNG terminal and bringing in liquefied natural gas. So the next phase potentially is moving to green hydrogen. It will be a massive undertaking. And that's why we are studying this very thoroughly, considering the options and looking at technology options as they mature. And as we crystallize some of the options available for Singapore, we will certainly go back to review our emissions targets.
Yeah. So one of the arguments for a high level of carbon price is actually that it will spur innovation. It will compel industry and countries to move faster in their transition plans. You've mentioned in your speech that you'll be reviewing the level of carbon price that we have for Singapore to shape the right behaviors, to shape the right actions. You know, we see that today our carbon price is at $5 per ton. The IMF has suggested that a price of $50 to $75 per ton is required for us to keep to a less than 2-degree world. And we see Sweden out there with $140 per ton. Could you preview for us what are your thoughts around what the appropriate level of carbon price might be for Singapore? How do you balance the trade-off between maybe the near-term impact on growth, competitiveness, versus the longer-term objectives of spurring innovation and getting us on the right path on decarbonization? I mean, these are not easy trade-offs to make. So if you could share with us a little bit about how you think about that, that'd be...
It's something we are deliberating very carefully. I'm not sure that I can share with you a preview of what's going to be in the budget. That may not be the most appropriate. But I would say getting the carbon price right is absolutely critical, because then you internalize the cost of carbon and it will influence business and government decisions. Businesses can then decide whether or not, based on the carbon price, certain investments and projects are worth doing. And likewise in government, we are already applying a carbon price in our evaluation of projects. And that helps us to decide whether or not to proceed for some projects, especially when they are marginal cases, but then with carbon price put into the equation, the cost benefits tilts towards a more favorable outcome. So having the right carbon price is absolutely critical. But I would also say, when you look at these examples you talked about, and you look at carbon prices around the world, look beyond the headline price. Headline prices are, of course, important, but it's also important to understand how comprehensive the coverage is. And if you just look at the data and you drill down, then you will see that it's not always the case that the highest headline prices have the widest coverage. I'm not trying to make trying to be defensive here. We will review and we will update our carbon prices. We need to do so because the last time we set it was some years back, and the world has changed, the environment has changed, and that's why we will need to do a review. But in fact, Singapore has one of the widest, most comprehensive coverages of carbon tax frameworks around the world. We cover about 80% of our national emissions. So what we want to do is achieve the right levels, but also achieve good coverage.
I think that's fair, and I think it also depends on which industry you're in, the support that's also given for the transition.
Absolutely. Well, to be fair also, I think carbon pricing is important, but as you yourself said, there's a balance to be struck with competition, with cost competitiveness as well. And I think we also need to realize that not all demand can adjust to this new price. From economists speak, some demand will be inelastic. So raising the price of carbon will simply end up with higher business costs for some businesses. Yep. I mean, it's not, they can't really they're already optimized their operations, and they can't do very much more to adjust. So carbon pricing, carbon taxes at a higher level will mean higher costs for them and will impact on their competitiveness. vis-a-vis other countries that may not have the same level of carbon tax. It is a real consideration and real concern. So what can we do? Number one, I think we need to think of solutions beyond the carbon tax, and regulatory solutions are important. So in some instances, not just in Singapore, but around the world, we do need to coordinate and think about regulatory solutions to phase out inefficient ways of doing things. Yeah. And that's why we are already talking about phasing out some appliances that are energy inefficient, the one-tick, two-tick types. Then you phase them out over time, and then you get people to start using more energy-efficient appliances. We can start thinking, already committed to phasing out internal combustion engine vehicles, and then move to cleaner vehicles. So regulatory moves are important. And at some points, internationally, we have to think about carbon border adjustments. Yep. Because there is, if one country is virtuous, but around you, other countries do not adopt similar moves, the activity that is high in carbon emissions will just move to another place. It doesn't help. Yep. So internationally, we will need to work through some of these mechanisms, and conversations are already being undertaken in G20 and other platforms. Yeah.
So, Minister, you mentioned in your speech harnessing technology and using data in a much more meaningful way to catalyze and support the sustainable investing and financing ecosystem. Can you share a little bit more about what Project Greenprint seeks to achieve and how we can actually capitalize on the opportunities for tech in Singapore? We've done a fabulous job with fintech. Obviously, green tech, I think, is another area that we should certainly gear ourselves up for.
Certainly. Greenprint is a project that MES has envisaged to help grow this new green fintech ecosystem. As I said in my speech just now, we have 3 goals: to mobilize capital, to monitor sustainable commitments, as well as to measure their impact. Data will be one of the things that we want to address, because it's a perennial issue in this new space. We need better data. We need to look at data consistency and comparability. We need to look at data provenance issues. And we hope that there will be technological solutions under Project Greenprint that will allow us to get better sources of data, make use of APIs to allow for better seamless connection across different data silos, those sorts of things. So I think getting better data enablers will help tremendously. But data is an enabler. The next question is, what do you do with this? So we are still at the early stages. We are engaging with industry, getting inputs from them, and there are interests from various parties, for example, to look at green trade finance, or to look at carbon tracking of the carbon footprint across the entire supply chain. And I think these are the initial use cases that we will start working on. And then over time, we can expand the use cases to other areas. For example, we can look at ESG certification for green products, green bonds, green REITs. The ESG certification comes from different registries, but potentially you can bring them all together on a platform through Greenprint, so that it's verifiable, it's easier to compare, and it's easier to access information. So we think there's a lot of potential to make full use of technology to grow this green fintech space. Just as you said, fintech had, the development of fintech in Singapore had really brought about new innovative solutions in the financial space. And I think with technology, we can look forward to new green fintech solutions as well to help us, to take us forward in sustainable financing solutions.
Just to pick up your point you mentioned about certification. So obviously, you talk about taxonomy, you talk about standards, and there's a whole alphabet soup that needs to be aligned, and hopefully the ISB can do that for us. But do you see a role for Singapore to play as a center for standard setting, verification, ratings, along those lines, to help the region and to help the world set the right benchmark from which we can progress?
Certainly, certainly. That's why, as I mentioned, MES has been involved very actively in all these areas: taxonomy, data, disclosures. We are involved as part of international conversations. There are platforms internationally which MES is actively involved in. We are also looking at specific standards, taking into account these international developments. What are some of the standards we might want to set for ourselves and for the region? Recognizing that we need to take into consideration the region's circumstances and context. For example, in Southeast Asia, we have many countries which are fossil fuel producers, also very reliant on fossil fuel energy. We also have millions of people in Southeast Asia which still do not have access to electricity and clean water. So when we talk about sustainable goals for them, we really should look at it holistically. And that transition away from fossil fuels to clean energy in some countries will be a progressive one, realistically. And that's why being able to have a taxonomy that provides clarity on what constitutes transition activities that really contributes to our decarbonization objectives is important. So some of these metrics and standards we do have to develop for Singapore and the region, and we are actively working on this together with our regional counterparts.
Yeah, as you've mentioned, I think the region does have a lot of work to do to transition. And actually yesterday, Filia Salim mentioned, and I think we all know that there's actually a significant gap in financing for sustainable infrastructure in the region. Clearly, we've taken a leading role in Singapore. The government has said it's going to issue green bonds to support 19 billion of infrastructure spending. We're seeing a lot of Singapore corporates issue sustainable bonds and loans as they progress in their own sustainability journey. Do you see a role for us to play to build a bigger market for sustainable financing in the region to help our neighbors to finance, their infrastructure project? Because no man is an island, but we are, and actually we can do so much, but we need everybody else to also contribute to the effort. So is there something that we can do to help galvanize necessary private investments into these areas?
Absolutely. That's really part of our objective of trying to be a sustainable financing hub to serve not just Singapore's needs, but the broader regional needs. And the key is really to be able to start unlocking some of these marginal projects, marginally bankable, but not getting financed now, and therefore that finance gap is huge for many good, sustainable, green and transition projects. It's huge. Unlocking that is the key, and we've been looking at different ways of doing it. One way, of course, is through blended finance. We bring together different sources of capital. Some of these providers are prepared to provide concessionary capital. It could be non-profits, it could be philanthropic capital, it could be multilateral development banks, and they are prepared to accept a lower rate of return for social and environmental objectives. And by doing so, you can then you can improve the overall returns profile of the project and bring in commercial capital. I think that's an idea that we've been working on, and the sustainable financing platform announced today by Temasek and other partners is in that direction. So as I said, we welcome ideas along these lines. We welcome other private stakeholders to join the platform, and we want to expand this space of blended finance and other financing solutions that can push us along, help move us forward in sustainable finance. In the end, it's more than just about mobilizing capital. I mean, that's a key part of it, but in the end, it's also about bringing people together and the ability to have that network of expertise and ideas that can advance our agenda. And that's what being a sustainable financing hub means, and that's what we aim to achieve.
So I know we run out of time, but can I just sneak in a final question?
Wow.
As we
Not
aim
about
to
COVID.
not about COVID. As we aim to build ourselves as a sustainable financing hub, in the same way we build ourselves as a wealth management center, what do you see are the challenges to get us there? I think you mentioned new skills and capabilities are required. We need to build capacity. But what do you see are the key challenges along the way?
I think the key challenge is people. There are different aspects to this. of course, don't get me wrong, we have quality people in Singapore, very good Singaporeans who understand this space. We just don't have enough of Singaporeans. That's our problem. That's our karma, basically. We have too few Singaporeans, and we need more people, more talent to grow anything in Singapore, and especially in a knowledge-intensive sector like finance. So if we can continue to stay open, connected to the world, have in Singapore that mindset that we will be open to talent, ideas, and assemble the best team in Singapore, I think that will help advance our agenda, enable us to stay as an international finance center, and then layer upon that the value proposition of sustainable and green finance. I think the other aspect of people, besides the mindset of staying open, is the attitude that we should not ever be complacent and take our hub status for granted. That competition is real. I mean, this is not as though we have arrived and it's such a natural thing from being a financial center to then becoming a green finance center. Yep. Nothing good ever falls on your lap. You have to work hard for it. And I think if we have that attitude and mindset in Singapore, if our people have that mindset, that we need to continuously have that drive, that hunger, to chase after that next deal, to bring in more investments, to grow our economic pie, and to achieve even better results in sustainable finance, then we will be able to achieve our goals.
Thank you, Minister. I think we certainly have a daunting task ahead of us, but with collective, immediate action, with partnership between business, governments, and civil society, I'm sure humanity can rise to the challenge. Thank you so much for your remarks and for your insights today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister.